There is a kind of cold that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with wind or warning. It accumulates the way debt accumulates quietly and with interest until the morning you check your account and discover the number is no longer what you thought it was. The Cascade Range in January is that kind of cold. Not dramatic, not cinematic, relentless and arithmetical and completely indifferent to whether you survive it. Master Sergeant Kane Mercer had been operating in extreme cold environments for 22 years. He knew what frostbite felt like in its first stage, the false warmth that preceded the damage. He knew how many minutes exposed skin could function before fine motor control began to degrade. He knew the way lithium batteries behaved when the temperature dropped past 20 below, the way they did not die suddenly but retreated, conserving what little charge remained in some deep chemical instinct that was almost biological, until even that final reserve was gone and the device in your hand became $800 of inert plastic and metal. He was thinking about the batteries when David Lane went down. It happened the way these things always happened. Not with the drama that civilians imagined when they pictured combat. Not with slow motion or music or the long suspended moment of film. It happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Lane was moving, and then Lane was not moving, and the snow around him was a color it had not been before. Kane pressed himself against the boulder and did not move. 22 years had trained him not to move. The instinct to go to a fallen man was real, and it was powerful, and it would get you killed, because whoever had put Lane down was still out there, still watching, still patient, and the moment you broke cover was the moment you became the next target. Kane had learned this lesson in other mountains, under other conditions, at a cost he did not think about while working. You did not think about costs while working. You paid them later in the gaps between, in the 3 o'clock silences. He breathed through his nose, not the mouth. Breathing through the mouth in this temperature meant losing moisture with every exhale, meant dehydration compounding. On top of the cold meant the quiet mental fog that did not feel like dying until you were already most of the way there. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. He had been doing this long enough that it was no longer conscious, just architecture. To his left, Chief Petty Officer Rel Caulfield was behind a snow ridge that had been chest high at the start of the operation. It was not chest high anymore. Wind and blown powder had reduced it to something closer to mid-thigh. Caulfield was pressed flat against it in the posture of a man doing mathematics he did not like. His primary was up. His eyes were on the north approach. He had not looked at Lane. Caulfield was 20 years in. He knew not to look at Lane. Behind them, both wedged into a shallow rock crevice that offered marginally more protection than open ground, Petty Officer Marcus Doyle was applying his second field dressing to Petty Officer Jonah Farrell's left thigh. The first dressing had gone through in 11 minutes. The fragment had caught Farrell just below the hip, not deep enough to be instantly fatal, deep enough to be comprehensively serious, and the mathematics of that kind of wound in this temperature without surgical support was a calculation Kane had already run and not shared with anyone. He kept his breathing even, counted his rounds. 7. Caulfield had signaled 4 with his hand, then closed his fist. Doyle had 11. Farrell was not shooting anything. Petty Officer Blake Oates and Corpsman Stellan Hale were somewhere on the far side of the bowl, and Kane had not been able to confirm their exact status for several minutes, though he could still make out the occasional shift of Oates' silhouette when the wind moved the powder. 8 men in, 1 down hard, 1 bleeding. 6 functional, and functional was a generous word for men who had been pinned in a natural bowl at negative 29 degrees Celsius for the better part of an hour with their communications dead and their extraction window closing. The comms had failed at the 38-minute mark. Not jammed. Kane had been around enough electronic warfare to know the difference. Jamming had a signature, an aggressive interference you could feel in the equipment, even when you could not break through it. This was different. This was simpler and worse. This was the cold reaching into the radio housing and having a quiet conversation with the battery chemistry, and the battery chemistry conceding the argument. The backup handsets were in the pack David Lane had been carrying. The pack was out there in the open ground, 12 feet from Lane's body in a direct line with the sniper's position. Kane had considered going for it twice. Both times a round had come within 10 inches of his head, the moment he shifted his weight more than 45 degrees. The sniper was not suppressing them. He was managing them. There was a difference, and it mattered. Suppression was about volume, about keeping heads down through sustained fire. What this sniper was doing was more surgical. Single rounds spaced, placed with precision, sufficient to keep 8 men stationary without wasting ammunition. He was saving his rounds. That was the thought King kept returning to. A sniper conserving ammunition in a containment situation was a sniper who expected the containment to end, who was planning for a different phase of the operation, who was waiting for something else to arrive and do the work he was currently doing more expensively. Kane looked at his watch. 0347. They had been on the ground for 61 minutes. The mission brief had been clean. A weapons cache tracked across 4 states linked to a domestic extremist organization operating under the name The Covenant, identified through signals intelligence as staged in a remote supply facility in the Upper Cascade Wilderness. 8 men, standard interdiction, in and out on a 12-hour window with exfil via the southern ridgeline. Simple. The word had a particular taste now. What no one in the plywood-walled briefing room at Joint Base Lewis McChord had mentioned was the secondary element. Not the 4 guards at the cache who had been neutralized in the first 6 minutes with the efficiency of good intelligence and good execution. The second group, the one that had come from the north approach with a tactical precision that did not match the profile of a domestic militia. Coordinated fire, overlapping fields. A sniper position before the team entered the valley, which meant the position had been prepared in advance, which meant someone had known not just that a team was coming, but the specific route and the specific timing. Kane turned this over the way he had been turning it over since the first shots came in, and his brain operating on the pattern, recognition of 2 decades noticed something wrong in the geometry of the ambush. The angles were too clean. The coverage was too complete. This was not a lucky intercept. This was prepared ground. Someone had given them the coordinates, not the cache location. The insertion coordinates, the specific point where 8 men had stepped off their transport and begun moving through the dark. That information existed in exactly 3 places: the mission brief, the operations center at Lewis McChord, and the chain of command above both. He did not pursue this thought further. Not now. Now was for the immediate mathematics. Later was for the larger ones. The sniper had fired at roughly 4 to 6 minute intervals for 40 minutes. Regular enough to maintain pressure, irregular enough to prevent pattern-based prediction. The last round had come 9 minutes ago. Kane had counted. 9 minutes of silence from the north, and the silence had a different quality than the intervals between previous shots. It did not feel like patience. It felt like a shift in phase. Caulfield had noticed it too. Kane could see it in the angle of his shoulders, the coiled stillness of a man who had recalibrated his threat assessment without being told to. Mercer. Caulfield's voice barely above the wind. Kane turned his head a fraction. Something's changed. Not a question, an observation, a data point offered between 2 men who had worked together long enough that the full sentence did not need to be spoken because the important part was the conclusion. 12 minutes since the last round. Kane kept his voice at the same register. He's not out of patience. Then he's waiting for something. Kane said nothing. That was confirmation enough. Behind them, Doyle's voice came from the crevice, quiet and controlled, the voice of a man reporting a status rather than expressing an emotion. He's still with us, but I need surgical in under 3 hours or we're in different territory. 3 hours. Kane filed this without letting it alter his expression. You did not let the math show on your face. Not when other men were reading your face for information about whether they should keep fighting or whether they should be doing something else with their remaining time. He shifted his position 2 inches to get a new angle on the north approach. The sniper did not fire. Either he had not detected the movement or had, and made a decision not to respond. The second option was worse because it meant the containment protocol had changed. It meant something was coming. Kane looked at the east face of the valley. He looked at it the way experienced men checked every possible approach in a contested space automatically and without stopping to think about why. The east face was granite, 60 feet of near vertical rock glazed with ice with a significant overhang at the top that made it geometrically impossible to descend without equipment no one in this valley possessed. He had assessed it as non-viable in the first 2 minutes and had not changed that assessment. He changed it now. There was something on the east face. It took him 3 seconds to process what he was looking at, because what he was looking at did not fit the established parameters of the situation, and the brain resisted information that violated its current model of reality. It preferred alternative explanations. A shadow moving strangely. A section of ice dislodging. An animal. Not an animal. A person. Small, moving down the ice-glazed rock with an unhurried confidence that was incompatible with the angle and the conditions. No rope visible. No hardware. Moving hand to foot across the face the way a person moved when the route was memorized rather than discovered, when the rock was not terrain to be solved, but a path they had taken enough times that the solving was long finished. Caulfield had seen it too. Kane could tell by the way he had gone absolutely still. The figure reached the snow at the base of the east wall and straightened. Small frame. Layers that did not constitute any uniform. Kane recognized civilian gear combined with military components, without concern for which was which. A jacket that had been some definite color once and was now the color of prolonged exposure to everything the mountains could produce. Boots laced with a precision that was almost compulsive against the chaos of everything else. A bolt-action rifle, old in the way that things that worked perfectly were old, maintained to the end of its functional life rather than replaced. The figure's hands were visible. Both of them. Arms slightly out from the body, the posture of someone moving through contested ground who wanted to be seen, not drawing. The hands were bare, in negative 29 degrees. Exposed skin in this temperature began losing sensation in approximately 4 minutes. The hands were also, Kane noted, covered in ink. The figure stopped, looked directly at him across 30 meters of open snow. How many? A voice pitched low, aimed precisely, carried by the wind, without being lost to it. Kane stared. The figure did not repeat itself immediately. There was a patience in the silence that was not aggression and not deference. The patience of someone who had asked the right question and was allowing the person on the receiving end the time required to catch up. North approach. How many shooters? Kane's mind was doing several things at once, assessing threat, assessing capability, running the tactical logic of the moment. The figure's hands were visible and empty. The rifle was slung, not raised. The posture communicated intent in ways that the body communicated more reliably than words. But his mind was also doing something else. Something it did not always do quickly in high-stress situations, which was assemble the available visual data into a coherent picture. Young, that was the first word that assembled itself into something he could use. Young in a way that landed wrong against the backdrop of the east face and the bare hands, and the question that had been delivered with the flat economy of someone who had been in enough bad situations to stop wasting words on the merely terrible. Not young the way a child was young in the way some people were young, a quality of bone structure and proportion that persisted regardless of what had been done to the person carrying it. She was at the outside, 17 years old. Her eyes were doing something that took Kane another second to identify, because it was not what he expected and not what he was trained to look for in a threat assessment. The eyes were not hard. Hardness implied closing a fortress posture, the shutting down that happened to people after a threshold of exposure to certain categories of event. These eyes were not closed. They were open in this way. Deep water was still not absence, but depth, and they were taking in the bowl and the snow and the dead man in the open ground and the crevice where Doyle was working and the position of every man on Kane's team, and they were doing all of this without producing any expression he could read as emotion. 2, he said, because the question had been specific and operational, and there was no tactical reason not to answer it. Maybe 3. Sniper went cold 6 minutes ago. She processed this, did not nod, moved to the boulder on his right without waiting for an invitation, and brought the rifle up to her shoulder in a single motion that contained no hesitation and no ceremony. She pressed herself against the rock with an economy that went beyond concealment, using the geometry of the stone itself, the way its profile masked her barrel from certain directions while preserving her angle on others. Oates had materialized at the right edge of the bowl, drawn by movement or instinct. His face carried the expression of a man trying to locate a category for something resisting categorization. Tattoos, Oates said. His voice carried a specific inflection, not hostile, not fully credulous. She did not respond. Who are you? Caulfield's voice. Harder, not hostile, but establishing. The voice of a senior man who understood that the establishment of terms was not optional in a contested space, regardless of who was asking. She did not look at him. She was scanning through the scope with total attention, the kind that had become structural rather than deliberate, the way breathing became structural. You need to know where the sniper is. Her voice carried the same flat precision as the first question. You need to know how many men are coming from the north. You need to know whether your man in the crevice has 3 hours or 1. A pause. You don't need to know who I am. The silence that followed was not the silence of men who had been defeated in an argument. It was the silence of men performing rapid recalibration. From the crevice, Doyle's voice quiet and without ceremony. She's right. Caulfield exhaled, set his jaw, turned back to the north approach. Kane stayed watching her. The thing about the bare hands was working in him. In the cold in the field, you did not leave your hands bare. Not as a preference or a comfort issue, as a functional matter. Without fine motor control, you could not work. A trigger could not clear a malfunction, could not perform any of the 100 small mechanical operations that the difference between alive and not alive frequently reduced to. In negative 29 degrees, bare hands were not a choice. They were a countdown. Her hands were bare and had been bare since she descended the east face. The ink covered both from the knuckles upward. He looked at it the way he looked at everything in the field, quickly and completely. The back of the right hand carried a notation that did not read as decorative, formatted in a way that resembled operational notation, the kind that appeared on topographic overlays in mission planning contexts. Coordinates or something very like them. The left hand was different. A series of small marks ran along the inside of the wrist toward the palm. Hash marks organized in groups of 5, the universal notation of a count. He counted them without intending to. 3 complete groups of 5. 2 additional marks. 17. He was processing this when she changed the angle of the rifle by a fraction so small he would not have detected it if he had not been watching her hands. They have a drone, her voice was unchanged. Northeast 180 meters, moving slow. They're using it for terminal positioning before the assault element moves in. The information landed with the weight of a diagnosis. Kane understood immediately. The sniper had gone quiet because the drone was doing his work, painting the exact location of every man in the bowl and feeding that information to the assault element, which would use it to close the final distance with their exposure minimized and Kane's positional advantage negated entirely. The boulder, the crevice, the snow ridge, all of it mapped, all of it communicated to men who would know exactly where to aim before they arrived. Can you hit it? He heard it as he asked it that it was also a test. She did not treat it as either. Yes, simple. The word of someone reporting a fact rather than making a claim. Blade, she added. You hit the rotor blade at the right angle, it fragments. The fragment takes the motor housing. The motor housing has the battery. She paused. You don't want to be standing below it when the battery goes. To his left, Caulfield made a sound that in significantly better circumstances might have qualified as something approaching a laugh. How far, Kane asked. What's your effective range on a moving target in this wind? She considered this with an honesty that he found irrationally more reassuring than confidence would have been. I need it at 150 or less. She said it without apology or performance. The wind in this valley changes at the gradient junction. At 200 meters, I'm managing variables I can't model in real time. He looked at her, at the ink on her hands, at the 17 marks organized and deliberate on the left wrist. He thought about Lane out there in the snow, about Farrell and the mathematics of the next 3 hours. Okay. He said it, one word. Then because something needed to be said that was true and did not take time he did not have. When this is over, you're going to tell me who you are. She was already back in the scope. She did not answer. The drone was at 164 meters when she first had a clean read on the rotor configuration. 4 blades standard commercial quad setup, the kind of equipment that cost a fraction of what military specification hardware cost and left no supply chain record. The operator had skill. The movements showed judgment, deliberate positioning, intelligent use of air currents to minimize battery drain. But the stabilization was doing what commercial stabilization did, which was compensate rather than anticipate. And in compensation, there was a pattern. The rear left rotor produced a micro instability every time upwind turbulence caught it at the right angle. She had seen this specific pattern before in this type of terrain with this class of commercial hardware. It lasted approximately 0.2 of a second. In that window, the geometry between the blade and the motor housing junction opened to a viable angle. 0.2 of a second. She breathed through her nose. The cold air hit the back of her throat the way it always did, sharp and total, like breathing through metal. She let the body settle into it rather than resist it, the technique that could not be taught in any conventional sense, only arrived at through enough exposure that the choice between fighting the cold and existing within it became obvious. One of those costs paid in the gaps. Not now. The drone was at 152 meters. The operator had stopped it. Getting his feed, final positioning confirmation, she found the oscillation cycle. Timed it. Once. Twice. Consistent at 4 seconds between peaks. She let the third cycle pass unfired, confirming the consistency was real and not a brief regularity in an irregular pattern. It was real. She took half a breath and stopped breathing. To her left, Kane said something. Quiet and urgent. She registered it the way she registered everything in this state, which was to say it entered her awareness and was assessed and classified as not the trigger and set aside. There was the scope. There was the rotor. There was the wind, which she knew. There was the cold, which she had made a separate peace with a long time ago in different mountains under conditions she did not think about while working. The oscillation peaked. She fired. The valley swallowed the shot. The sound went out and did not come back in any recognizable form absorbed by the cold and the snowpack and the acoustic geometry of the bowl. In enclosed terrain, a rifle shot echoed, bounced, and returned from multiple surfaces simultaneously. Here the cold was dense enough and the snow deep enough that the sound went out and came back so altered it barely registered as the same event. Then the drone screamed. Not a human sound, a mechanical scream, the sound of a motor experiencing catastrophic asymmetric stress. One rotor gone and three remaining in desperate and futile compensation. The stabilization software pushed back, overcorrected. The pitch became a yaw. The yaw became a roll. She had moved 2 steps to the left before firing repositioning behind the extended face of the boulder without announcing the movement, because announcing it would have taken a full second she did not have. Kane had moved with her. She did not know if it was instinct or the operational intelligence of a man who had learned to read situational geometry, but the result was the same. When the battery vented, the pressure wave went into open air. The detonation was not massive. By the standards of the ordnance both sides had been deploying, it was modest, but it was sudden and bright, and it happened directly above the staging point of the assault element, coming from the north, close enough to produce not casualties, but the thing that was in this moment more operationally valuable than casualties. Confusion. 3 seconds of it. Men ducking men, losing visual men, defaulting to the ingrained response of covering. When something detonated overhead, their brains processing incoming before they could process where from and why. 3 seconds in which trained men were operating on instinct rather than training, and instinct said to be small. Kane was moving before the echo finished. She watched him go, not the whole arc of it. She was already resetting to find the sniper's revised position, but enough. He moved with the density of someone for whom movement under fire had become so practiced, it no longer occupied conscious bandwidth. He reached the pack at lane side in the 6 seconds, was back in cover in 9. He held the comms pack against his body as he moved, warming it with what heat remained in him. He crouched behind the boulder and pressed it against his chest, against his coat, coaxing the cold-soaked battery with body heat the way you coaxed anything that needed warmth and could not generate its own. For 3 seconds, broken by static and barely coherent something came through the partial signal, a designation or the fragment of one. Noise took it apart before it completed, but 2 syllables arrived intact through the interference, and those 2 syllables landed in a part of Kane's memory that cross-referenced instantly with something he could not yet place and did not yet have time to place. He held the handset against his chest, against the heat of his body, and said nothing about what he had heard. Uncertain information offered at the wrong moment was worse than no information. He would be certain or he would be wrong. Either way, he would know more later. He keyed the emergency frequency, 4 seconds, their GPS coordinates, into whatever was or was not listening. The battery gave out after that and did not recover. She found the sniper. He had not completed his repositioning. He had read the drone detonation correctly, read it as the action of someone with optics on the field, and had abandoned the move in favor of going to ground where he was. Pressed flat into the rock scree at the left margin of the north approach. A professional decision, correct in principle. But pressed bodies displaced snow when they arrived at speed. And displaced snow settled differently than undisturbed snow, the surface fractionally wider, the structure fractionally more compacted. And in this light, the overcast sky diffusing evenly across white ground, the displacement was visible to someone who had looked for it before. She waited. 40 seconds. In this temperature, flat on the snow without movement was not a sustainable tactical position. It was a countdown. Even the best disciplined body eventually demanded blood move through. It demanded that some tendon shift or some joint flex, demanded the small mechanical concessions that kept tissue alive and functional. At 41 seconds, the sniper moved his left elbow. A fraction. Enough. Her second shot was quieter than the first. Less drama, no secondary. The valley absorbed it the same way. In the rock scree at the north margin, nothing moved after that. The wind dropped. This sometimes happened in the bowl, a momentary equilibration of the pressure systems that drove the constant circular howl, a brief stillness that made the space feel larger than it was and quieter than it had any right to be. In the new quiet, Kane's voice. Caulfield. He kept it below where voices carried. Get Farrell ready to move. Doyle status, 2 hours outside. Maybe more if the cold is slowing the bleed. Doyle's voice flat and clinical. 2 hours from my last check, which was 20 minutes ago. Call it 90 minutes from now if nothing changes. Kane absorbed this without changing his expression. 90 minutes inside the window the ping had opened, if the ping had reached anyone worth reaching. 90 minutes was a number that could be made to work if everything else went correctly, which was the category of assumption that got men killed, but was also, in the absence of alternatives, the only category available. He turned, looked at her. She had already moved to the southern margin of the bowl and found her angle on the approach corridor, covering it without being asked, without a protocol to follow, simply doing what the geometry required because she had read the geometry. 7 out, -1, plus whatever she had brought to the bowl, which was not addition, but a different kind of accounting entirely. He watched her move to the south margin and cover the approach while Hale and Doyle performed the transfer of Farrell from prone to supported carry, the movements dovetailing with the wordless precision of people who had rehearsed this motion. Oates pulled security. Caulfield organized the route. He and Oates went back for lane. They wrapped him with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this before and had learned to separate the act from its meaning while the act was being performed, to let the meaning arrive later when there was space for it. Then they moved south. She covered the approach the whole way. There was nothing behind her that required looking at. Ahead was the ridgeline. Ahead was the window Doyle had given Farrell. Ahead was whatever came after tonight, a calculation she had learned not to run in advance because the variables were always wrong and the answer was always different from what you expected. One thing at a time. That was not a philosophy. It was the only arithmetic that consistently produced results in the kind of work she did. She watched the corridor. The men moved behind her, steady and deliberate, carrying their dead and their wounded through the dark and the cold toward a ridgeline that represented the possibility of something continuing. She kept watching and let the valley keep its silence. The approach was clear. For now, that was enough. They stopped twice on the south approach before reaching the ridgeline. The first stop was Hale calling a hold to adjust the carry position on Farrell, whose dead weight had shifted during a section of uneven ground and was putting torque on the dressing Doyle had placed and replaced twice already. The adjustment took 90 seconds. Hale worked without commentary, his hands moving through the procedure with the muscle memory of a man who had performed field medicine in conditions designed to make it difficult and had decided somewhere along the way that commentary was energy he could not afford. The second stop was the comms pack. Kane had been working with it since they left the bowl, coaxing the cold-damaged battery with body heat, holding the handset inside his jacket against his chest, the way the Army had taught him to treat hypothermia, warmth by proximity, slow and patient and without guarantee. The ridge gave them elevation. Elevation gave them line of sight in a direction the bowl had not permitted. And the battery warming 1 degree at a time against the heat of a body that was itself losing heat produced something. Not a clean signal, not the strong two-way communication that extracted units from difficult situations and put warm meals in surgical teams at the end of transport chains. What the battery produced for 4 seconds was a coherent pulse on the emergency frequency. A ping, GPS coordinates attached. Their location transmitted once into whatever receiver was or was not listening in the frequency range of the Northwest Operations Net. 4 seconds was not a conversation. It was a knock on a door made without knowing if anyone was home. Kane looked at the handset after it went quiet. Then he put it away. North of them, in the bowl they had left, there was no sound. The assault element had withdrawn during the confusion window. He had tracked their movement by listening to what was not there. The absence of directed fire. The silence that meant men moving away from a position rather than toward one. Professional. They had made their decision without visible drama and executed it without visible emotion, and in doing so had demonstrated the kind of disciplined operational flexibility that confirmed Kane's original read. This was not a militia, not in the conventional understanding of that word. He said nothing about this out loud. He kept moving. They found a position on the south face below the ridge, out of the wind's direct line with rock on 3 sides and a clear angle on the approach corridor. Enough cover to wade in. Not enough cover to be comfortable in, but comfort was not a category that applied to anything about the current situation. Doyle set up on Farrell immediately. Hale assisted without being asked. The two of them communicated in the shorthand of people whose professional vocabulary had compressed over years of shared fieldwork into something closer to gesture than language. Caulfield posted on the north angle. Oates took the east. Kane took the overall picture, moving between positions, looking at everything, committing to nothing, in a situation where the situation itself was not yet finished changing. Nora was on the south corridor approach. She had been there since they stopped, not covering it at intervals, managing her attention across multiple responsibilities, covering it the way she covered everything he had observed her covering tonight, total and continuous and requiring no apparent allocation of effort, the way breathing required no allocation when breathing had become the only available activity. He gave it 20 minutes before he moved to stand near her. Not behind her, not close enough to interfere with her angle or her attention. Far enough that the movement did not constitute an encroachment, close enough that low speech would carry. She did not acknowledge him. She did not need to. He was in her peripheral vision, and she had assessed him and classified him as not a threat and assigned him to background awareness, which was the most functional thing she could do with his presence and exactly what he would have done with hers. The corridor was clear. They both knew it was probably clear. The enemy element had withdrawn north, and the more likely threat was reorganization rather than immediate pursuit. But probably was not certainly, and standing down a covered approach because probably was not a tactic with a good historical record. She kept watching. He watched with her for a while and did not say anything, because there was a quality to the silence that was not uncomfortable, and forcing speech into it would have reduced something. Then, the marks on your hand. It was not quite a question. He had learned over enough years of extracting information from people who were not inclined to provide it that the question format often produced defensive responses from people who had good reasons for their defensiveness, while the observation format sometimes reached answers the question would not have. She did not respond immediately. He waited. He was good at waiting. 17 of them, he said. I counted. A pause that had duration without being empty. She was deciding something, not whether to tell the truth, whether to tell it in a form that would be manageable for the person receiving it. Each one is a name. She said it the way she said things that needed to be stripped of framing flat and direct. Then she looked back through the scope. He stayed where he was. He was thinking about what a person did with 17 names, what it meant to carry that count in a medium that could not be lost or degraded or left behind, could not freeze up in a cold housing or get left in a pack on open ground, was always present and always readable in the dark and in the light, and in the worst moments of a bad operation, when you needed to remember exactly what the arithmetic of your situation was, whose names. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might have decided not to answer. Then, without looking away from the scope, she said something that was neither deflection nor complete answer, but contained both. People who were here. He waited, and then weren't. The wind had settled into a lower register since they left the bowl. Not still, this range was never still, but moving now at a pitch below the howl and above the whisper, the sustained sound you stopped hearing after a while and started simply existing inside of. 14 months of mine to keep track of. She said it like she was reading from a document. 3 more of them were someone else's count. I took them over. Kane processed this. 17 names, some hers by proximity and some by adoption, carried because she was the available carrier. He did not ask what had made her the available carrier. He already had the rough shape of the answer from the terrain evidence alone. You did not spend 18 months alone in the Cascade winter learning a 60-kilometer radius of mountain topography from the inside unless you had arrived at the decision to be alone here through some specific and catastrophic event. You did not descend an unclimbed ice face in negative 29 degrees at 4 in the morning unless the mountain had become more habitable than whatever existed on the other side of it. There was an operation, she said, 18 months ago, not far from here. She said it the way people said things they had said to themselves many times in private, the way repetition of a thing eventually stripped it of its acute quality without removing its weight. 12 people. I was attached as a designated marksman. She paused. 4 of us came out of the initial contact. He waited. We got hit again. Different position, same enemy element, same tactical signatures. She stopped. Used his name not as a dress, but as a device, a way of ensuring the next sentence arrived with its full weight. Kane. The same signatures. Coordinated approach, same sniper, pre-positioning, same intelligence quality. He heard what she was not saying. He let it sit between them unspoken while the shape of it clarified. Someone gave them your insertion coordinates too. She did not answer. She did not need to. He looked at the ink on her left hand. 17. 14 from that operation and its aftermath. 3 from something before it. A count that had outgrown whatever private accounting system she had started with and required a medium that could not be misplaced. You came back to this range after that. I did not leave it. He absorbed this. 18 months. Through 1 full winter and 1 summer and into the second winter. In terrain where experienced units with full logistics chains and properly rated equipment routinely lost people in the first 72 hours. Why? She considered this with an attention that suggested the question deserved actual consideration, rather than the reflexive answer, because no one came back for them. She said it the same way she said everything flat and without performance. So I did. The South Quarter was clear. had been clear for the duration of the conversation and would remain clear. Kane knew this and she knew this, and neither of them moved because the conversation had its own logic that was separate from the tactical situation, and interrupting it would have meant it did not resume. And he had the sense, not from anything she said, but from the quality of her attention, when she was not looking through the scope, that this was the first conversation of this kind she had been part of in a very long time. He looked at the right hand. The notation on the back of it, formatted with precision, he had been cross-referencing against his operational experience for the last hour. The coordinates, he said. She looked at her own hand. The look was not self-conscious. It was the look of someone reading a note they had written themselves. The valley where it happened. So you don't forget where it is. So I don't forget where they are. A small correction. The distinction was quiet, but it was there. There's a difference. He looked at the rifle, old in the specific way of something maintained to the edge of its design life through continuous care rather than institutional replacement. This weapon had never been in a supply chain. It had not come from an armory or a procurement process. It had been obtained or modified outside every system he had spent 22 years operating within. Who authorized you to the operation 18 months ago? Who put you in the field? The scope did not move. She was deciding something. It was not a formal attachment. She said it carefully, not evasively, but with the precision required to be accurate. I do not have a formal record. I do not have a file, a service number, or any documentation that would connect my presence in this mountain range to any organization that a person could ask questions of. He was quiet, letting this land. Someone used you off the books. Someone used me because I was effective, and because off the books meant no paperwork and no questions and no accountability in any direction. She paused. That arrangement worked for a long time. It stopped working when I watched 12 people walk into a prepared ambush and understood that the preparation required information that could only have come from inside the operational planning process. Kane felt the cold in a different way. Not the temperature. You saw it happen. I survived it happening. The distinction was there, quiet and specific, the kind of distinction that people made when the difference mattered to them, even if it mattered to no one else. And afterward, I was the only one left. Whoever had authorized my involvement decided the cleanest solution was to close the file. He looked at her. Close the file. She took her eye from the scope. Looked at him with a steadiness that was not hardness, not coldness, but something that had been arrived at through a different process than either. I was declared KIA. She said it without particular emphasis. 18 months ago, there is a record in some system that has my name attached to a date and a location and a classification level that makes the record itself inaccessible through normal channels. And because I have no formal service record to begin with, because I was never officially attached to anything, there is no one to notice the inconsistency. He heard the full shape of it now. You cannot report what you saw, because officially you were not there. And the person who authorized your involvement is the same person who declared you dead. She looked back through the scope. He said nothing for a while. The wind moved through the rocks above them with a sound like slow breathing. He thought about the insertion coordinates, the geometry of the ambush, the tactical sophistication of the assault element, the sniper position before they entered the valley, which required prior knowledge not just of the target location, but the specific route of approach, the kind of prior knowledge that existed in exactly one place in the operational planning process. He thought about the fragment he had heard in the static of the comms pack, the two syllables that had arrived intact through the interference. He had held them at the back of his mind since the bull, running them against everything he knew, waiting for the cross-reference to complete. Who authorized you? He asked it directly. The name. She held the scope for a long moment. When she answered, her voice was the same as it had been for every other piece of information she had delivered tonight. Flat, precise, stripped of everything that was not the information itself. When you get back, she said, you will receive a briefing about what happened tonight. The explanation for how your insertion coordinates were compromised will be coherent and documented and wrong. The person who gives you that briefing is the same person who gave your coordinates to the Covenant, the same person who authorized an operation 18 months ago and then closed the file when the operation produced an inconvenient witness. Kane waited. Colonel Warren Stills. The name landed in the cold air between them. Kane looked at the south corridor. His mind was reorganizing 18 months of operations in this region around a different load-bearing point. Stills, Northwest Special Operations Command, regional authority for every action in this mountain range for 4 years. He thought about the operations that had gone wrong in ways attributed to difficult terrain and degraded intelligence, and the unpredictable variables of mountain work. He thought about how many of those variables could be recategorized if you changed the premise. How long have you known? 3 weeks after it happened? She said it without drama. I had time to think. 18 months of time. The operational signatures matched. The intelligence quality required sourcing. I went backward through everything I knew and arrived at the only conclusion the evidence supported. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and removed a small USB drive flat and black. She held it without offering it yet. 18 months is a long time to do nothing but walk these mountains. She said it, and there was something in it that was not quite dry, but was in the neighborhood. I had access points at lower elevations. I had discipline and patience and intervals of solar exposure on the south-facing slopes for charging. I had time. Kane looked at the drive. The financial transfers go back further than the operation 18 months ago. She said it carefully. Stills built the network. The Covenant is not an organization he discovered and failed to suppress. It is an organization he built infrastructure for using discretionary operational funding that was not tracked through standard channels. The weapons cache your team was sent to destroy tonight was one node in that network. She paused. The operation tonight was not an interdiction mission. It was a cleanup. The cache location had been compromised by separate intelligence that Stills did not control, and he needed it gone before it was exploited in a way that would reveal the broader network. Your team was sent to destroy the cache, and then your team was going to be the next thing that needed to be cleaned up. Kane held this the way you held something very heavy, not comfortably, but with the understanding that setting it down was not the available option. She held the drive out. He took it, put it in the interior pocket of his jacket against his body where it would stay warm and stay with him regardless of what happened to anything else. I have been out here alone for 18 months with evidence that a senior officer coordinated with a domestic extremist organization to murder U.S. Special Operations personnel. She said it with the clinical quality of someone reporting a diagnosis they had been living with long enough that the shock was exhausted. I cannot surface it. I do not exist. Anyone I give it to through normal channels goes through a chain of command that still sits at the top of in this region. You have operational standing that I do not. You have a face and a record and a chain of command that extends past his regional authority. He understood. He understood also why she had given it to him specifically. She had not given it to him because she trusted him. She had given it to him because he was the right vector. Those were different things, and she understood the difference, which was part of why he trusted her more than he would have trusted someone who appealed to him emotionally. You will need to go above regional command immediately, she said. Do not brief anyone in Stills's chain first. He nodded once, and he almost did not ask the next question. He had decided not to ask it, and then heard himself asking anyway because it had been sitting in him since the bowl, since he counted 17 marks and registered the incompleteness of the 18th, since she had described it without completing the description. The last mark. He said it carefully. The one that is not finished. She was quiet. The official report said 11 died at the point of contact. She said it the way people said things that had required a long time to reduce to this level of compression. I found 11 at the contact site. I counted. He waited. The 12th man's name was Eddie Barton. He was the corpsman for the element. He was hit early in the first contact before anyone confirmed his status. She paused. I went back. 3 days after, when the area was cold enough to be safe, I found where he fell. I found the wound evidence. I found a trail. Kane was very still. He moved after he was hit. She said it with a care that suggested she had rehearsed this account not for someone else, but for herself to keep the facts precise against the possibility of wishful contamination. Not far. 400 meters approximately in the direction of the lower south slope. That direction contains one structure, a ranger station decommissioned empty for at least 5 years based on the condition I found it in. He looked at her. You think he made it to the station? I found evidence at the station, occupied evidence, habitation signs that were not there before the operation and were present 3 weeks after. She said it with the neutral tone of someone preserving the separation between observation and conclusion. Boot tracks in the spring mud. Boot size consistent with Barton's profile. He said nothing. I have been supplying the station since last spring. She said it. Food, medical basics. The supplies have been taken. His voice when it came was careful. You have not made contact directly. She shook her head a fraction. Not until I am certain the station is not under observation. If Stills knows Barton survived and has been there for 18 months, the station could be identified and monitored, waiting to see if anyone goes looking. I needed the area clear before I went in. The area is now missing one sniper and one assault element. Kane said it with the flatness of a man acknowledging a tactical reality he had not created. Yes, but it is also the area where Stills just lost both of those assets in a single night. Also, yes, he looked at the south corridor for a moment alongside her, two sets of eyes on clear ground. The left hand, he said, the mark that is not finished. She looked at it, a brief look, the kind you gave a familiar thing that required only occasional direct attention to remain real. I do not finish counts until they are closed. She said it simply, and that one is not closed yet. The rotors came as vibration through the rock before they came as sound. Kane felt it through his boots, first the specific frequency of two helicopters running at the same RPM pattern coordinated, coming in from the south below the cloud ceiling. He looked at his watch, 4 hours and 9 minutes from the emergency ping, 4 hours and 9 minutes, Farrell was alive. He had Doyle's confirmed word on that, and Doyle did not give confirmed words on things he was not certain of. He stood, checked his sector once more, looked at Caulfield, who had already signaled the others and was organizing the carry for Farrell with Hale. Oates was pulling security in the direction they had come from, covering the approach until the last possible moment before the landing zone became the priority. He looked at Nora. She had not moved from her position on the south corridor. The helicopters were louder now, the sound resolving from frequency into recognizable mechanical signature, two birds coming in fast and low. Come with us. He said it directly because he had no time for the indirect approach, and because indirect approaches with her had not demonstrated a strong success rate. She kept watching the approach. You need extraction, he said it. You have been out here 18 months, and you have evidence that a senior officer tried to have you killed, and you need to be somewhere you can surface it in a way it cannot be made to disappear. She turned her head a fraction and looked at him with the deep water steadiness that did not belong to hardness, and did not belong to resignation, and did not yet have a category in his internal filing system. I have been surfacing it, she said. I just put it in your pocket. The helicopters crossed the ridgeline. The sound became total. He looked at her for a moment longer than the situation required. Then he turned and moved toward the landing zone because she was right about the helicopters and because arguing further in the next 20 seconds would change nothing, and he knew it the way he knew when a position was indefensible and when holding it anyway was discipline and when it was something else entirely. Behind him, the south corridor remained clear. She remained on it. The first helicopter touched down 40 meters south of the ridgeline rotor wash, driving the powder up in a white wall that cut visibility to nothing for 3 seconds and then thinned. Caulfield and Hale moved Farrell aboard with the efficiency of men who had done this under fire and found the current conditions manageable by comparison. Oates pulled back from his security position and loaded. Doyle was already aboard, hands still working the work, not finished simply because the venue had changed. The second bird handled Lane. 2 men from the flight crew received him with the formal care that military dead were afforded, the precision that was not ceremony in the decorative sense, but in the sense of acknowledgement of making clear that what was being moved had been someone and remained someone regardless of the present tense. Kane loaded last. He stood on the skid for 1 moment before pulling himself up and looked back across the ridgeline toward the south approach. She was standing at its edge, the rifle at her side, the layers and the boots in the ink and the stillness. Looking at the aircraft without looking at him, her attention on the helicopter, the way her attention was always on the thing most relevant to the current moment and nothing else. She had given him everything she had to give. 18 months of evidence in a direction, in a vector, in the correct analysis of a situation he was going to have to carry back into a chain of command that contained the person responsible for it. The account between them was settled in the only way that mattered to her, which was functionally, and what came next was his to carry. He pulled himself aboard. The helicopter lifted. He watched her through the open door as they banked south and gained altitude. She watched the aircraft until the angle changed and the ridgeline rose between them, and then she was below the frame of what was visible, and then there was cloud and rotor noise, and the particular silence that happened inside the noise when the thing you had been looking at was no longer there to look at. He put his hand against the interior pocket of his jacket. The drive was there, still warm from her body and now from his. He kept his hand there for a moment. Below the cloud ceiling in the dark, the Cascade Range continued to be what it was. The helicopter had been in the air for 6 minutes when the comms pack produced one final fragment. Kane had not been trying to receive anything. The pack was spent, the battery giving nothing more than the faint warmth of a chemical process grinding toward its end. He was holding it from habit, the way hands reach for familiar objects under stress, And for 3 seconds, the dying battery found something it had not found before, a last coherent frequency in a spectrum it had been trying and failing to reach for 4 hours. The transmission came through the static like something surfacing from deep water. Stills actual. Target package confirmed extracted. North approach primary is cold. Then static, then silence. Kane held the handset and did not move. To his right, Caulfield was watching Doyle work on Farrell in the rear of the cabin. Oates was looking out the side window. Hale was sitting with the stillness of a man who had done everything he could do and was waiting to find out if it had been enough. None of them had heard it. The cabin noise was too high and the signal too partial, and Kane had been holding the handset against the side of his head in a posture that directed the audio toward him specifically. Target package confirmed extracted. He turned this over. The target package, not the weapons cache destroyed in the first 6 minutes, not the Covenant element which had withdrawn. Target package was a term used for an intelligence asset, a human element for something acquired or secured, or in this context, something successfully removed from the operational area. They had been watching the exfil. Stills had been monitoring the emergency frequency, or someone on his behalf had been, and when the ping went out with their GPS coordinates, he had known exactly where they were and when the helicopters arrived. And now someone was reporting to Stills Actual that the extraction was complete. In the bowl, Kane had heard 2 syllables through the static and held them at the back of his mind, waiting for the cross-reference to complete. Now it was complete. He put the handset against his thigh. He thought about what the transmission meant and what it did not mean. It did not mean Stills knew about the USB drive specifically. It meant Stills knew his team had been extracted alive, that Kane was on this aircraft, that whatever Kane had seen and heard and done in the valley tonight was now moving south at 140 knots. Stills would begin calculating. He would anticipate a debrief. He would have had a version of the narrative ready from the moment the operation was set in motion, the explanation for why the insertion coordinates had been compromised, the coherent and documented and wrong account of events that Nora had described. He thought about how long he had before the aircraft landed and the chain of events a landing would initiate. He thought about who he could call and who he could not call. He thought about the specific instructions she had given him, alongside the drive, which was to go above regional command immediately and not brief anyone in Stills' chain first. And he understood now, with a clarity he had not fully possessed on the ridge, why the instruction had been framed that way. Because Stills was already listening. He pressed the USB drive through the fabric of his jacket with 2 fingers. Still there. Still warm. He put his head back against the cabin wall and looked at the ceiling and thought about 22 years of operations run inside a command structure. He had trusted the way you trusted the frame of a building, not by thinking about it, but by standing in it and assuming it would hold. He thought about the operations in this region over the past 4 years that had gone sideways in ways attributed to terrain and weather and the chaotic variables of mountain work. He thought about how many of those variables had names. He thought about Nora Voss standing on a south-facing ridge in -29 degrees, watching the helicopter take the only thing she had built in 18 months away from her and into a system she had every reason not to trust, trusting it anyway, because the arithmetic said it was the correct move and she did arithmetic rather than sentiment. He thought about Eddie Barton. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep. He simply closed his eyes and let the noise of the aircraft and the cold still living in his bones and the weight of everything in his interior pocket exist without managing any of it. There would be time enough for managing it, a great deal of time probably, and none of it would be simple. But the drive was in his pocket, and Farrell was breathing in the rear of the cabin. For now, that was enough. Now that Joint Base Lewis McChord was lit at 0500, the way military installations were lit, at that hour functional fluorescent light that acknowledged nothing about the hour and served the singular purpose of making activity possible, regardless of what the sky outside was doing. The aircraft set down on the medevac pad, and the coordinated machinery of a base receiving a unit home from a bad night began immediately and without fanfare, because fanfare required distance from the thing, and this was not distance. Farrell went directly to the surgical facility. Doyle went with him, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had been managing the situation for 4 hours and intended to finish the handoff properly and with his own eyes on the process until the surgical team had the full picture of what they were receiving and why. The senior flight medic suggested Doyle could be debriefed first. Doyle looked at him. The medic did not suggest it again. Lane was received by 2 personnel from the Mortuary Affairs Unit who were present on the pad before the aircraft fully shut down, which meant the notification had gone through correct channels and people had had time to be where they needed to be. There were things military process did badly and things it did with a precision that had no civilian equivalent, and the receipt of the dead was one of the latter. Kane watched it happen with the attention of a senior man who was going to remember how it was done, because remembering how things were done was part of what you owed the people they were done for. Then the debrief room. Institutional furniture. A table that had been in this room or rooms identical to it for so long, it had ceased to have individual character. 2 chairs. A recorder on the table and a water bottle next to the recorder, and a notepad that no one would write on because everything was going through the recorder. The man who came through the door was a colonel from the regional operations staff named Geddes, who had presided over 2 previous debriefs Kane had participated in. Geddes had the administrative competence of a man who believed in process and applied it without asking the questions that would have revealed what the process was being used for. Not corrupt, not complicit, the kind of honest administrator that a corrupt system depended on most. Kane sat across from him and looked at the recorder and thought about what he was going to say. He told Geddes about the operation. He gave a complete and accurate account of every element of the tactical situation. The insertion, the ambush, the loss of Lane, the injury to Farrell, the communications failure, the assessment of the enemy element's capabilities and probable composition. He gave the account in the order events occurred and with the level of operational detail that a senior man was expected to provide, because the operational detail would not be what this account was ultimately about, and it was better for the account to be irreproachably complete in the parts that were not contested. He said nothing about Nora Voss, not yet, not in this room with this recorder through this channel. He had made this decision on the aircraft and had not revisited it because the decision was correct, and revisiting correct decisions was energy with no return. He said nothing about the transmission he had heard on the comms handset. He said nothing about a USB drive or what was on it or where it currently was. Geddes asked about the intelligence quality of the ambush, how coordinated the enemy element had been, whether Kane had any assessment of how the Covenant force had known their approach route. Kane said he had an assessment. Geddes waited. We were working off insertion coordinates that someone with access to our mission planning knew in advance. Kane said it flat and direct, the way operational information was supposed to be delivered. The ambush geometry required pre-positioning. The sniper was in place before we entered the valley. That is not possible without specific intelligence about our route and timing. Geddes wrote something on the notepad. Then he put the pen down and looked at Kane with an expression that was not quite readable. Not defensive. Something more careful than defensive. That is a significant assessment, Sergeant. Yes, it is. Do you have a direction for it? A source, not through this channel. He said it the way Nora had said things that needed to be said with precision. I need to escalate this directly. Above regional command. Geddes looked at him for a moment longer than comfortable. That is an unusual request at this stage, I understand. Kane held his gaze. It is the appropriate request given the nature of the assessment, a silence that had duration and content. Geddes said, I will need to make a call. Kane said, I will wait. He waited for 37 minutes. The water bottle had been full when he sat down and was mostly empty when the door opened again, because waiting required something to do and the water was what was available. The man who came through the door the second time was not Geddes. He was older. 2-star. Kane recognized the face from the broader command structure, had seen it at operational briefings in the past 18 months, had assessed it both times as belonging to a man who had made a large number of consequential decisions and been made heavier by each one. General Harold Breck. Northwest Army Command, which placed him outside Stills's regional authority by one full layer of institutional separation. Kane looked at him. Breck looked at Kane. Sergeant Mercer. He said it with the weight of someone being specific about who they were addressing. I understand you have something that needs to come directly to my level. Kane reached into his interior jacket pocket and put the USB drive on the table between them. Then he told Breck everything. Not in the order it happened, because the order it happened was not the most efficient way to convey the structure of what was on the drive and what the drive implied. He told it in the order that produced the clearest picture, the way a competent man briefed a superior on a complex situation, conclusion stated first, and supporting evidence organized to substantiate it. He told Breck about Nora Voss, about 18 months in the Cascade Range, about 17 names and one unfinished mark in a decommissioned ranger station on a south-facing slope, about a corpsman named Eddie Barton, who the official record said died at the initial point of contact and who had left that point of contact under his own power, and traveled 400 meters and who had apparently not died in the more private location he had been moving toward. He told Breck about the transmission on the comms handset. Stills actual. Target package confirmed extracted. He told Breck about Colonel Warren Stills. Breck did not interrupt. This was a quality Kane had not fully appreciated before this moment, and appreciated very much now. The ability to sit with information that should have been interrupting and to not interrupt was not common in men who held the rank Breck held, and its presence here meant something specific about the man's relationship to the information he was receiving. When Kane finished, Breck sat without speaking. Then he picked up the USB drive and turned it over in his fingers once. "How long has she been out there?" He asked it quietly. 18 months, January through January and into the second January. Breck looked at the drive, alone. "Yes, sir," a silence with weight in it. "Not bureaucratic, something else." Breck said, "I need to make several calls. None of them will go through regional command." Kane said he understood. Breck stood. He was at the door when he stopped and looked back. There was something in his face that was not quite an expression and was not quite the absence of one. The girl. He said it not as a diminishment, but as a recognition, the way you said a word when you were aware of what it designated and what it had been required to carry. "How old?" Kane said 17, maybe less. Breck looked at him for one more moment. Then he went through the door. Stills was arrested on the 23rd day. Kane was in the surgical waiting area with what remained of the team when it happened. 6 men minus Lane and pending Farrell's outcome, and the information arrived through the institutional atmosphere before it came through any official channel. He felt the shift in pressure the way weather changed before it arrived, and said nothing because the others would know soon enough, and knowing sooner through the air of a waiting room was not a better version of knowing. Farrell came out of surgery at 16:12 on the day they returned. The surgeon spoke to Doyle first, which was technically irregular and situationally correct, because Doyle had been running the medical picture for 4 hours, and the surgeon understood that certain professional courtesies transcended protocol. Then the surgeon spoke to Kane. He used the word stable. He used the phrase full recovery, with a qualification that the qualification was about timeline rather than outcome. He said the margin had been thin, and that certain decisions made in the field in the early phase of the injury had been determinative. He said this looking at Doyle. Doyle said nothing. He went to sit down. Hale put his hand on Doyle's shoulder briefly and then removed it. Oates looked at the ceiling. Caulfield looked at Kane. Kane looked at the window. Outside, the January sky over Lewis McCord was the color that skies were at this latitude in this month, low and gray and non-committal, the kind of sky that made no promises about what it intended to do and had been making no promises for months, and would continue making no promises for months more. Not an unkind sky, an indifferent one. He thought about negative 29 degrees and a south-facing ridge, and 7 men moving toward a ridgeline in the dark. He thought about who had been covering the approach. Caulfield found him in the corridor at 700 and sat down next to him with the ease of a man who had long since stopped requiring comfortable furniture to rest in. "Doyle says Farrell makes it." Kane said nothing. Caulfield looked at the wall across from them. He was quiet for a moment. Then the girl. Kane looked at him. "Who is she?" Kane considered what to say and settled on the version that was true and complete, and also not more than was appropriate to say in a corridor at 700 on the morning after a night like that. "She is the reason 7 of us came home tonight." Caulfield absorbed this with the talent he had for absorbing things without visible reaction, a talent Kane had always appreciated. He nodded once. "She coming in." Kane looked at the corridor ahead, at the institutional lighting and the institutional floor, and the door at the end that led to a building that led to a base that led to a world that had for the past several hours been operating on the assumption that certain things were true, that were not true, and certain things were impossible that had happened anyway. "No," he said it. "She is not coming in." Caulfield nodded again. Not the nod of a man who did not understand. The nod of a man who understood exactly and had decided that what he understood was something he could hold without needing it explained further. They sat in the corridor together without speaking the way men sometimes sat after specific shared experiences. The silence full of the thing they had both been inside of and were now sitting at the edge of, not ready to step away from it completely, not able to stay fully in it. The formal investigation took 11 weeks. Kane was interviewed 8 times by personnel from 3 different investigative bodies. He provided complete and accurate testimony each time the conclusion stated first, and the supporting evidence organized to substantiate it the same way he had done with Breck in the debrief room. What he discovered across those 11 weeks was that institutional processes moved at a pace calibrated to the weight of what they were processing. Stills had been in the system for 26 years. Unwinding 26 years of files and relationships and signed orders required the kind of patience that did not feel like patience from the inside. It felt like waiting in corridors with cold water bottles, while recorders that never stopped running captured your account of a night that the official record had not yet decided how to describe. The fourth interview was harder than the first. The eighth was harder than the fourth. But the drive had been in Breck's hands since 0530 on the morning after the Valley, and the drive contained what it contained, and the facts did not change to accommodate how difficult it was to process them. Breck met him once more 11 weeks in. Same room, same table, same water bottle, or one identical to it. Sergeant Mercer. Sir. Breck looked at the table for a moment before looking at Kane. He had the gravity of a man who had made a large number of consequential decisions and added another large one to the account in the past 11 weeks and felt the additional weight precisely. The proceedings are moving forward, Breck said. The evidence on the drive was corroborated by independent sources. There will be outcomes. He paused. The nature of those outcomes I am not in a position to specify in this room at this time. Kane said he understood. The girl, Breck said. Third time he had used that word in that way. Have you had contact? No, Kane said it. I do not have a way to contact her. She is not in any system. Breck nodded. He looked at the table. Then, when this concludes to the extent that it concludes, there will be people who want to debrief her. People above my level. He paused. I would appreciate any information about how to reach her if that becomes available to you. Kane looked at the man who had moved in 4 hours on information he had no precedent for, and who had not, in 11 weeks of proceedings, allowed any element of those proceedings to move through a channel that Stills had the ability to monitor. He thought about what Nora had said about vectors, about giving things to the correct person rather than the trustworthy one, and whether those two categories could overlap. He said, if it becomes available to me, I will pass it along. The spring came slowly to the Cascade Range that year. The snow held through the first week of March and then began its retreat. Not dramatically, but in the gradual hydraulic process of seasonal change, the melt beginning at the lower elevations and moving upward, degree by degree, revealing the terrain beneath, in the order it had been covered the valley floors first, and then the mid-slopes, and finally the high ground, where the snow was deepest and oldest and last to let go. By April, the south-facing slopes below the 4,000-foot line had opened sufficiently for movement without snowshoes. The ground underfoot was wet and unstable in places where the melt had not yet drained, and solid enough in others that a person who knew the terrain could move across it at a reasonable pace without significant difficulty. Nora moved across it at a reasonable pace. She had been moving since first light, following the route she had followed several times in the months since January. The route from the cache point to the outer perimeter she had established at 200 meters from the station. She had assessed and reassessed this route against the possibility of observation and found it acceptable. The evidence of Covenant presence in the area had been diminishing since January, which was consistent with an organization whose command structure had encountered significant disruption. She did not know the specifics of that disruption. She had no newsfeed and no radio, and no contact with any system that would have reported it. What she had was a significant reduction in Covenant activity in the 60-kilometer radius she monitored, in the absence of surveillance patterns that had previously indicated organized interest in the area, and her own assessment of what a regional paramilitary organization did when its leadership was removed, which was fragment and disperse, and spend several months managing internal chaos before reconstituting, if it reconstituted at all. She also had the distinct absence of any attempt to reach her, which told her more than presence would have. If Stills remained operational and remained aware of her existence and remained motivated to address the fact of that existence, there would have been an attempt. The mountains would have shown her the shapes of it. She had been reading the shapes of this terrain for 18 months, and she read what was there and what was absent with equal care. The ranger station appeared through the trees at 230 meters. She stopped and observed it for 4 minutes from a fixed position. She had established this as her minimum observation protocol in January and had not shortened it because protocols existed for reasons that did not change based on comfort or impatience. The station was 40 years old and showed it. Built for seasonal occupancy, not maintained in 5 years and 5 winters, at this elevation did specific things to buildings that were not maintained, settled the foundation and warped the siding, and compromised the roof in ways that were structurally significant, but had not apparently been fatal to the building's capacity to provide shelter. It stood the way things stood when they had been built to withstand a load, and the load had been applied for a long time, tired-looking but present. The stovepipe on the east side showed residue at the cap. Recent residue, the brownish deposit of combustion product that accumulated over time and had a specific appearance when it was active versus when it was old and weathered. This residue was active, recent, within the last 48 hours. She moved to the door. She knocked the way she did everything with precise and specific intention, 3 times spaced evenly. A pattern she had established as her approach signal at the cache drops always the same because consistency in signals was how you distinguished known contact from unknown contact when you were operating with one person and limited bandwidth for ambiguity. A silence, long enough that she counted it, then a sound from inside. Movement, the kind that came from a body managing itself with care, the sound of weight being transferred deliberately from one point to another. The door opened. Eddie Barton was taller than she had estimated from the boot-sizing evidence. 41 years old by the operational file she had reconstructed from memory. He had lost weight, which was expected, and had grown a beard, which was also expected, and stood in the doorway holding the doorframe with his left hand, in a way that suggested his right leg had not fully recovered from what had happened to it 18 months ago, which was also expected, given that he was standing at all expected and something else entirely. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. She looked back. She was good at looking back without speaking. She had had 18 months of continuous practice. He said, "I heard the knock, the pattern." He said it as if confirming something he had needed confirmed for a long time. "I figured someone was going to come eventually. I just did not know who." She said nothing yet. She was doing what she always did when new information was available, which was look at it completely before speaking about it. He looked at her the way people looked at things that did not fit their model of the situation. Not disbelieving, the way you looked at something that was true and that you had not been certain was true, and now you had to update the model. "You have been coming here." He said it, leaving things at the cache point. I could tell it was the same person. The spacing was always exactly the same. "Yes. How long?" "Last spring," she said it. "Almost a year of supply drops." He absorbed this. A year. He looked at her the way men looked when they were doing arithmetic with emotional content and were trying to keep the arithmetic and the emotion from interfering with each other. He said, "Who are you?" She said her name. He was quiet. Then, "They said you were dead." "Yes." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "Everyone was dead." He said it. After the second hit, I could not go back. My leg. He said it the way people said things they had said to themselves many times, and that had not gotten lighter for the saying. "I know." She said it. "I went back." He looked at her. I counted. She said it. "Everyone." I came up one short. He said nothing for a long moment. The trees moved in the April wind above the station. The sound of things that had been still for a long time beginning to move again. The particular sound of seasonal change arriving at the upper elevation, tentative and then more certain. She pulled back the left sleeve of her jacket. 17 complete marks. The 18th begun and stopped, the second stroke missing the tally incomplete in the way that an open account was incomplete. She reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and removed the small tattoo implement she had been carrying for 3 weeks since she had assessed the situation as close enough to resolution to prepare for this possibility. She sat down on the step of the station door, not asking permission, not requiring an invitation, simply sitting the way she sat in any position once she had determined the ground was not contested. She looked at the 18th mark, the incomplete line. Then she completed it, not as a tally of loss. The second stroke of the mark went where it needed to go and created what it created, which was a complete mark in a row of 17 others that had been marks of exactly one kind for 18 months and were now marks of a different kind entirely. The kind that meant present, the kind that meant accounted for, the kind that meant the count was closed not because someone was gone, but because someone was found. She pulled the sleeve back down. Barton was standing in the doorway watching her. His right hand was still on the frame. His left had released it sometime in the past minute. He was standing on his own, which he could apparently do, which was information she added to the model. He said, "How do we get out of here?" She looked up at him. She thought about a USB drive and a man with a general stars and a process she could not manage from a ranger station and correct vectors and the arithmetic of trusting imperfect things because the alternative was trusting nothing. "There are people expecting to hear from me." She said it. "When the time is right." When is the time right? She looked at the south slope below the station at the spring mud and the exposed rock and the retreating snow line and the mountains extending south and west in the specific way they extended when you had been looking at them from this angle in every season for long enough to know them the way you knew the inside of your own hands. She said soon. The word was not a promise, not a comfort or a reassurance or a prediction offered to make the person receiving it feel better about the uncertainty. It was an operational assessment based on available evidence delivered with the flat precision that all her operational assessments were delivered with. It was also in its way the most she had said about the future in 18 months. She stood. She looked at the 18th mark one more time through the fabric of her sleeve. 18 marks in a row on her left wrist. All of them complete. All of them accounted for. The count closed not with loss, but with the specific and hard-won arithmetic of someone who had gone back when no one else would, who had looked closely when everyone else had stopped looking, who had carried the number, not because it was her job or her assignment or her designation, but because she was the only one left to carry it, and zero was unbearable. And she had decided a long time ago in a valley not far from this one that unbearable was not the same as impossible, and that the distance between what was required and what was available was a space you filled with yourself and nothing else. She looked at the south slope and the retreating snow and the mountains in the early April light and the sky above them, which was the specific color it was at this elevation in this season, not the gray of January, but something different, something that had moved past non-committal into a range that had not yet made any specific promise, but was at least finally considering the question. She said, "Come inside, tell me what you need." He held the door. She went in. The mountains held the cold of the previous season in their north faces and their deep couloirs in the places where the sun had not reached since October. It would be weeks before those faces let go of it, before the melt completed its full arithmetic and the range became what it became in summer when the snow pulled back to the highest ground and the terrain below it breathed and the granite showed its actual color and the trees at the high line moved in a different kind of wind than the winter one. The station had a window on the south face. Through it, the light came in at the angle that south light came in April horizontal, enough to reach the back wall, warm enough to mean something. It was the first light of a different season. Outside, the mountains went on being what they had always been, which was indifferent to survival and not opposed to it and in possession of a silence that was older than any of this and would be here long after all of this, holding in it the specific record of what people did in difficult places and what they became in them and what they carried out with them when they came, if they came into whatever waited on the other side. What waited was not simple. It was never simple. But the count was closed and the account was clear. And somewhere south of the ridgeline, a man with the general's stars was holding a small black drive and moving through a process that was imperfect and slow and still in the way that imperfect things sometimes were the correct thing to be inside of. And in a decommissioned ranger station on a south-facing slope in the Upper Cascade Range, two people who the official record said were dead were sitting in the April light, and one of them was explaining what she needed, and the other was beginning for the first time in 18 months to believe that what came next was a category that applied to him. The light came through the south window. It landed where it landed. The mountains held their silence and required nothing of anyone, which was the most generous thing about them, and the most indifferent, impossibly in the right circumstance, the closest thing they had to kindness.